to be talking in Leuven in English that I realized that it would probably be difficult for me to give a talk in Dutch/Flemish because I don't know the technical terms. You know, it's like my professional identity has really been shaped by English. But one thing I got here, apart from the fact that my introduction to philosophy was based on Plotinus and Proclus, and I had no idea at the time how unusual that was. But the thing that I always kept with me from my years here is the importance of texts and not just of arguments or a technical terminology that is taken out of its context. So I think the methodology that I learned here at a young age always stayed with me. Now I have a confession to make. I'm slightly nervous. If I were to paraphrase a famous saying of Augustine about Antiochus of Ascalon, I could be accused of desecrating a shrine of Platonism with the ashes of Stoicism. How dare I? But yes, I am going to talk about the relationship between Platonism and Stoicism. And it's been a recurrent theme in my research that the exchange didn't stop with the Skeptical Academy, right? And it didn't stop with Antiochus of Ascalon either. The traditional story is that Stoicism sort of dies out at the end of the 2nd century AD, but I think the back and forth between Stoicism and Platonism was quite a bit more extensive than the themes pertaining to epistemology or the goal of human life, which are the themes that people focus on when they talk about the debates with the Skeptical Academy. And that, in a sense, is very much what today's paper will be about as well. So I will read parts of my paper and I will deliver parts of it seminar style. And I've also given you some diagrams, just hopefully can make it easier for you to follow along. If my voice becomes too soft because I am still recovering from a cold, please raise your hand and I try to get some more decibels going. So the first thing you might notice is that I didn't translate nous in my title, the Stoics for nous and the thoughts of God. And I'm more and more moving away from translating nous as mind, because that has so many connotations in contemporary philosophy that I think are getting in the way, that are anachronisms for when we're talking about ancient philosophy. Now, I do use it sometimes in my paper, but it's not the notion that I like to open with. So this paper takes as its starting point the realization that Stoicism displaced nous. Intellect is my preferred translation. Nous and related words in favor of logos as the key designation for rationality, phronesis as the name for the virtue pertaining to reason, and the hegemonikon for the dominant function in the soul. And here we go. Doesn't take me very long to get there. The Stoics did so, I submit, in part as a polemical response to Plato's theory of forms. In the Timaeus, which the early Stoics co-opted for their own purposes, Plato systematically uses terms pertaining to the noetic, which I will use as a collective term for the entire semantic field pertaining to nous, that Plato uses these terms as a designation of the divine and the intelligible realm of being. In Stoicism, by contrast, the use of such terminology is either much more restricted or much less specific and technical. The Stoics appear, for instance, to have used the phrase of somebody having nous, ho nun echon, as an alternative designation for the sage. Origen, at any rate, does not hesitate to express his indignation. There's a lot of indignation about the Stoics in antiquity, that they did away with intelligible being in his Contra Celsum. Now, in this paper, I intend to use an analysis of the Stoic usage of language pertaining to the noetic to reopen the debate about what divine thinking in the Stoic cooptation of Plato's demiurgic model would amount to. And I will do so, this is important, primarily in dialogue with work by Francesca Alesi and George Boyce Stones. So there's been a kind of ongoing conversation between the three of us, and this is another installment in that exchange. So in his overview of Stoicism, Diogenes Laertius attests to the fact that the Stoics would use terms such as noesis and dianoia for thinking, right? Including thought processes. And basically, we can find all terminology pertaining to the noetic. The Stoics use it, but simply when they're talking about human thinking, especially we're talking about the early Stoa here. And they use it for what we might call thoughts in the sense of concepts. But there is one very important exception. So the Stoics downplay the noetic language, but there is one really important exception, and that's T1 on the handout. The world is directed by intelligence, nous, and providence. So says Chrysippus in the 5th book of his treatise on providence, and Posidonius in his work on the gods. Since intelligence, nous, pervades every part of it, just like the soul in us. So what is going on here, basically, is the Stoics, I would just argue, allow for this exception. Here, nous does play a prominent role, and nous is assigned to God because they want to capitalize on the connection between nous and pronoia. There is this very specific connection because pronoia is so important for them. And there is, of course, a famous passage in the Timaeus. This is T2 on your handout, where we find the notion of nous and pronoia in each other's vicinity. This then, in keeping with our likely account, is how we must say divine providence brought our world into being as a truly living thing endowed with soul and intelligence. Now, of course, in this passage, providence goes with the demiurge, and the thing that has the nous is the world's soul, but I will get back to that point in a minute. So what I did, what the first part of the paper is about, it's basically a semantic analysis. I'm not going to give you all the details of that semantic analysis, but I'm just going to read to you my conclusions because I think there are some interesting moves that are being made here. So my first claim is that the early Stoics use nous for the divine active principle, especially when they want to draw on the etymological connection with pronoia, when, in other words, they want to emphasize the providential agency of this divine principle and its role in the ordering of the world. Now, there's briefly my first little diagram on the blackboard. This is hardly news, but there is a puzzle in the Timaeus. There's these two aspects of the demiurge who, on the one hand, looks at the intelligible realm, the realm of being, and on the other hand, is responsible for the order in the universe. So how are we going to reconcile these two functions or these two aspects of the demiurge? And the Stoics were very much, I think, preoccupied with that question too. So we have the association now of nous with providence, I think, immediately brings together the rational component and the ordering function that is expressed in pronoia. So this move, I would argue, belongs with the early Stoic strategy of co-opting Plato's demiurgic model from the Timaeus. In the passage quoted above, Plato's demiurge endows the world soul with nous, but in a Stoic framework and in the ordered stage of the universe existence, God, world soul, and this nous would coincide. Moreover, the Stoic use of nous erases Plato's crucial reference to the intelligible realm as the proper epistemological object for nous. Now, next point, and I think is really, really striking. even when the Stoics use terms such as noeros and nous, they often subsume these under their primary notion of logikos and logos, right? So the combination of noeros and logikos, which we often find in Stoic sources, is not a mere rhetorical style figure expressing the same idea with two words or the hendiadys. It's meant to signal that the core notion is really logikos and that they understand noeros in the sense of logikos. That's the semantic anchor. And the same goes, I would argue, for the series nous, episteme, orthos, logos in Epictetus. Again, orthos, logos is the central notion. That's the magnet, and all the others are sort of have to be interpreted from that point of view. Interestingly, this actually might have some bearing on the emendations of Diogenes Laertius. Dorandi at some point wants to delete, I think it's a Noeros, from the text as a redundant element, but it's precisely this noeros kai logikos, or that is very important. That is the hendiadys that we find in Stoic sources. Now, if you go to some source material from Aetius, there's another point that really emerges, namely the relation between fire and nous. Okay. And that relation, the relation between fire and nous, and for those of you who don't have Stoicism at your fingertips, it's worth reminding ourselves that for the Stoics, the active divine principle is called a pure technikon, a creative fire. So it is corporeal in its own right, and it is a kind of fire. But the relation between fire and nous can go both ways. That is, in the sources, the language of our sources, the fire can be considered noeros, or the nous can be considered fiery. This reciprocity already indicates that the Stoics posit a very close connection between the divine principle's physical manifestation and its intelligence. And such a connection is also implied in the terminology of the seminal logos. God is the seminal logos, or the seminal logoi are derived from the divine logos, to designate the divine rationality as it unfolds in the universe according to a biological model, right? So we have the very clear anchoring of nous language in logos, and we have the very physicalist interpretation of talking about this nous as fire or this nous as some kind of seminal principle. And their meant is quite literally. So the biological model is the predominant model that the Stoics use for explaining the relationship between the divine active principle and the universe. Now, what I've said so far applies to the early Stoa, and the attribution of nous to God goes back to Zeno, according to our sources. Now, what we find in later Stoics, and we have strong instances of this in Epictetus and Seneca, this is the second bit on the blackboard, we get a translation, if you want, or their use quite suddenly of the notion of the thoughts of God rather than just seminal logoi or logos. Now I have to back up a little bit. We know that one way to deal with the relationship between the demiurge and the intelligible realm that is very prevalent in Middle Platonism is to think of the intelligible realm as the thoughts of the demiurge. So my hypothesis is that we see all of a sudden the thoughts of God show up in Seneca and Epictetus in a specific way as a response to that Platonist move. So it's one of those steps of the polemic continuing where they borrow and then reshape each other's terminology. The Epictetus passage is very interesting, but I'll let you read it. This is passage 3. I'll let you read it on your own, and we might come back to it in a discussion. But Seneca has the advantage of being succinct, so I'm going to read out the Seneca passage. The sage, this is T4 on your handout. The sage, and there is a comparison here between the sage by himself and Zeus at the moment of cosmic conflagration, when the order of the universe has all been reabsorbed into divine principle. The sage will lead the kind of life Jupiter has at that time when the world is dissolved and all gods are mingled into one, when nature ceases its operations for a while and he devotes himself to his own thoughts, cogitationes. What the Epictetus passage gives us, which the Seneca passage does not give us, is what God is thinking about. And in fact, according to Epictetus, even at the time of conflagration, God is thinking about his governance of the world. Right? So the thinking and the ordering function keep existing, coexisting. What is God thinking about? He's thinking about his governance of the world. So I'm skipping the rest of it because there's a lot more that I could say on that. But again, if you'd like to know more about these two passages, I'll be happy to discuss them in greater detail in the discussion session. But now I want to unpack a bit more what the role is of the seminal logoi once we start thinking of them as thoughts of God. In other words, then the question becomes pertinent to ask, well, how would this divine thinking work in Stoicism as opposed to in its Platonist counterpart? And this is where I really pick up the thread from a recent article by George Boyce Stones from 2021. So how then should we conceive of the operation of the divine logoi, once they're rendered as divine thoughts? So in a recent article in which he argues against some of my earlier claims and greatly advances our understanding of the issues at stake, George Boyce Stones has made the best case to date, based also on his analysis of the Stoic hierarchy's presentation of appropriation, oikiosis, that we should conceive of this operation as a kind of self-perception. So the divine thinking is a kind of self-perception that has an empiricist basis. So I want to say up front that this is a very good paper by George Boyce Stones. I happen to disagree with it, but maybe we can exemplify for once this disagreement with mutual respect. So that's what I'm trying to do at any rate. So there, this point about self-awareness, I think, is really well taken. And there is a passage in Epictetus that could actually reinforce this idea very explicitly. This is T6. But if our souls are so bound up with God, so it's about the relationship of human souls and God, and joined together with him as being parts and portions of his being, what is important here is the parts-whole relationship, does not God perceive their every motion as being a motion of that which is his own and of one nature with himself? So God's awareness of whatever happens with human souls is really a self-awareness, because human souls are part of the divine reason. But despite the merits of George Boyce Stone's analysis, I would like to make the case anew that divine reasoning in Stoicism, actually not in Platonism either, does not function in exactly the same way as its human counterpart. So in Stoicism too, there are crucial differences between the way the Stoic active principle would think and human beings would think. And okay, there's a bit of a warning here. This is the most speculative part of my paper, and I will make a little detour about it because we don't have the evidence one way or another. But I would like to revive the hypothesis, this is very important, that the Stoic God does not need to translate his impressions into so-called sayables or lecta, the propositions that accompany human impressions. Okay, let's back up a little bit. Again, for those of you who don't have Stoicism at your fingertips, how does the process of a human soul interacting with the world work in Stoicism? Well, it consists of 4 key terms. Information reaches us as what they call impression, fantasia. But in human beings, an impression is always immediately translated into a lecton, a sayable, that has a propositional form. Well, it could also be an incomplete statement, but some kind of enunciation. Then what happens is we assent or don't assent to that propositional, and then we can have, well, there are, if we have an hormetic impression, that is, if we assent to it, it will lead to horme, impulse, which would then lead to action. Okay? So, to back up, my claim is, it is true that in Stoicism, God has impressions, just as human beings do. But my claim is that God does not need to translate the impressions into lecta, into propositional content. And as I said, Ada Branovsky actually makes the opposite claim. And as far as I can tell, we don't really have evidence either way. So why am I advancing this thesis? Well, the difference that I would like to bring out is, as human beings, we're only part of the whole, and we need to do interpretation. We're not born rational, according to the Stoics. We grow into rationality, and we're always only a part of the whole. For us, there is an outside that we need to interpret, and that interpretation happens with lecta. So human thinking interprets the world. And the key difference is that divine thinking constitutes the world. These are the seminal logoi, these are the structures of reality. And God doesn't need to interpret anything. His thoughts just are these structural elements of the world. So they're constitutive of reality, not derived from it. And yes, that if I'm right on that, that is a function that is analogous to the role of the Platonic forms. They are constitutive of reality. Now, as I said, I've had quite a bit of pushback on the speculative point. And I have to admit that I'm slightly puzzled by the pushback. And I think that the pushback is motivated by somehow our inability to conceive of thought or rational processes that are not propositional. But of course, in the context of Platonism, that should not be a surprise. I mean, you know, it's the difference between discursive reasoning, which is propositional, and the mode of the intellect that is not discursive. So again, it would simply be the Stoics sort of alternative. But remember, the primary notion remains the logoi, right? Thoughts is just one way of rendering that notion. And for that reason, I've coined the phrase thought structures. They're not an interpretation of the world. They are constitutive. They are constitutive of reality. Now, I would like to, also given this audience, would like to make a little bit of a detour and go to Longinus. There's a very interesting passage in Longinus. But first, you could say, and you know, again, I looked at all the evidence, and which is, as is often the case with Stoicism, not as plentiful as we would like it to be. But if we go to, now I need my own hand up, the strongest argument against what I just said are these general statements, which we find in Diogenes Laertius and in Simplicius, is just a general claim. This is passage 7. They say that a sayable is what subsists in accordance with a rational impression. right? That's a very general claim. So if God has impressions, why doesn't God then have lecta? But of course, it works from lecta to impression. The sentence works from lecta to impression. It doesn't preclude that there might be impressions that do not come with lecta. So yes, that's the first issue. It's a very general claim, but it's also in contexts when they address human thinking, human thought. There is actually very little. Something happens there with Seneca and Epictetus is actually very little about God's thoughts, God singular. There are passages about God's plural, but that's different because God's plural also only just a part of the whole. So yeah, you could say, well, if this is a general definition, if you have an impression, you will have lecta. But as I said, that's open to debate. The other problem that we have, I wish we could do more. In Stoicism, there is a distinction between the logos endiathetos and the logos prophorikos. And then, maybe God only has the logos endiathetos, but actually our evidence on this is very limited. And it only becomes much more used in the Christian tradition. They're then ultimately making a lot of hay out of this with, the word became flesh and so forth and so on with that the Gospel of John. So they can't have help from that quarter either. Now let's go briefly to the Longinus passage, which might be a smoking gun that also contradicts my hypothesis. It's one of those really intriguing lines that we just wish Simplicius had given us more. He's talking about the forms there, and then he says, nor do that he's actually rejecting the Stoic view and then bringing in Longinus. So first he criticizes the Stoics, and then he says this about Longinus. Nor do they, like the hotly debated lecta, exist alongside the mind as Longinus opted to maintain. Okay, let's stop and pause here for a minute. It seems to me here that one possible way to interpret this passage, and I'm relying very much on Menline-Roberts' analysis here, is that Longinus made a connection between the thoughts of God and the lecta. Right? So that could maybe a smoking gun on the Platonist tradition, that there was a connection that Longinus was then able to draw on. But first of all, it's analogon. That's the first caveat. And secondly, I mean, I could really develop this much more, but for our purpose today is the fact that the lecta are incorporeal. For the Stoics, that means that they have a lower ontological status. The things that are real have to be bodies. But of course, in a Platonist context, you don't have that problem. The incorporeality of the lecta becomes an asset rather than a weakness, because then you can, in fact, align them with something incorporeal like the Platonic forms. So there is a shift happening here in the valorization. Right? So, all right. Let's bracket that hypothesis. That's one difference, I argue, that between divine thinking and human thinking in Stoicism is that divine thinking does the thoughts, that our thought structures do not require lecta. Now, it is true that God has set up the world in such a way that we human beings can derive lecta from it, but God himself does not need lecta. All right, now, go back to my paper. Now, there is another really important sense. So we have other evidence. It is late, but it's part of a much larger debate that, we can retrace, and it's absolutely fascinating to retrace. That we have evidence from Olympiodorus and David that the Stoics did not consider the divine ordering activity on the same level as human planning processes. So now we're talking about planning processes, which is what we need in order to get order in the world. And I want to just say something between brackets here, because this has recently come up in a paper. When Platonists talk about demiurgy, we can not automatically infer that they ipso facto adopt the artificial or the artifact model of the universe. Of course, originally demiurge in Plato does mean artisan, but the notion gets extended beyond that. So you cannot simply put an equation mark between demiurge on the one hand and the artisanal operation. In fact, what is very much the debate, and I also learned more about this from Alexandra Michalewski's recent book, is precisely the extent to which the demiurge can be or cannot be compared to a divine craftsman, right? That's a big issue in Platonism as well, Porphyry against Atticus, for example. But in Stoicism too, and some of it we can already find traces of it in Cicero's De Natura Deorum, so it's not all as late as Olympiodorus and David, that they also thought about the difference between God's way of ordering the world and human artisans. And we have the two texts here, but I'm only going to read the second one, the one by David, which builds on the Olympiodorus passage, which comes from the commentary on the Gorgias. And so what we should remember here is that the Stoics did describe the active divine principle as a craftsman-like fire, a pure technikon. So there is the notion of techne in how they describe the active principle. Therefore, we need to reflect on how this techne in the case of God is like or unlike the techne in human cases. So if we go to T9, on the basis of an impression is added because of nature, right? How does this ordering happen? For nature is also a tenor, since she has her being in things that have it, as in a human being, a stone, in a piece of wood, and moves methodically in its course, for she proceeds according to an order, but not on the basis of an impression, like a skill, techne. For the craftsman who uses reason when he wants to make something, first makes an imprint of what he wants to make, and then by this means creates it. But nature does nothing of that kind, for she does not first make an imprint of what she wants to make. All right, so let me help you here a little bit. Nature here stands for the active divine principle. The active divine principle, we have sources that say that God has fantasia, he has impressions. But the point is not that God doesn't have impressions. The point is that God doesn't need to rely on impressions to come up with a plan that then needs to be implemented. So again, I'm returning to my earlier point. This is what this part of my argument has in common with the previous part of my argument. The Stoic God, in his guise as nature, constitutes the reality of the ordered universe through his logos logoi. In the case of God's making, there is no time lag between acquiring the necessary information through impressions and carrying out a purpose, which human planning would entail. So in a nutshell, the Stoic God doesn't need to plan in that ordinary sense of the term. And this realization leads me to my final point of disagreement with Boyce Stones. It's another respect in which Stoic providence, I think, radically different from Plato's demiurge and human planning, for that matter. So Boyce Stones assumes that teleology in the making of the world by a divine principle would entail planning. We've talked about this. But now a specific sense of planning in the sense of considering alternatives, so that God's ordering of the world would be a kind of deliberation process whereby he would consider alternatives. If I do it this way, that will be the result. If I do it that way, that will be the result. Now, one could argue that that is clearly how Plato depicts his demiurge in the likely account of the Timaeus. We've already seen an instance of this. When the demiurge puts nous in the world's soul, he does so after having, quote unquote, deliberated that what is rational is better than what is irrational, and that nous requires a soul. There is a kind of reasoning process here. One could easily read this passage along the lines of a demiurge considering whether or not the universe as a whole should have a nous and why. But to add another bold claim to my analysis so far, I submit that the Stoic providential God does not operate in such a manner. And incidentally, the Stoic sage doesn't deliberate either, but that's a different issue. The Stoic God does not operate by weighing alternative options. And this difference emerges most clearly if we compare how Plato and Chrysippus treat the construction of the human head. This is a famous passage from the Timaeus that has been discussed quite a bit in the secondary literature. But I also think that if we compare it, so we have, it's the construction of the human head, the discussion in the Timaeus of the construction of the human head. And in a passage from Aulus Gellius, we have the same example allegedly being used by Chrysippus. But the way in which the terms are set up are so different, and that's, of course, exactly the difference that matters. Now, it's a long passage from the Timaeus, which you have on your handout, and that I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to read the summary, or just I'm going to give you the salient points. So this is the structure of the human head. And basically, the demiurge, again, this has been discussed, but I'm just reminding us, the demiurge is facing a trade-off between a thick skull that would allow humans to live longer, make us less vulnerable, and a sharper intelligence. Now, what matters here is the wording, the way this is being presented. It really is presented as a dilemma, as things that mutually incompatible. That's the key here, mutually incompatible. Right? So the younger gods, either they give the human head a thicker skull and a thicker covering of flesh, in which case it would be less fragile and the human being would live longer, but it would have less acute perception and be less intelligent. It's not only about reason, by the way, it's also about the acuity of sense perception. Or they use thinner bone and less flesh, which would not impede human beings' cognitive faculties, but make them more vulnerable and shorten their lifespan. And then, of course, the intelligence is preferable over the sturdiness. So there we go. All right. Now, when Chrysippus, by contrast, uses the same example to illustrate how the divine ordering works, his God or nature does not face a dilemma. And he, crucially, does not engage in contemplating alternatives. The goodness of the structure of the head, such as it is never in question. But this structure has certain implications, consequences, and that's expressed by the notion of parakoulothesis. So, in other words, when Chrysippus uses the example, he talks about things going together in a certain way. The order of nature means that things go together in a certain way. When Plato talks about it, he talks about a fundamental incompatibility, which is a remnant of the fact that the demiurge is to some extent hindered by the receptacle or by whatever condition he finds, well, literally or not literally, as present in the world. Right? So the same example, but the way it's set up could not be radically more different. And if I sort of put it in a more colloquial way, the Stoic God has, quote unquote, made up its mind. This is the way it's going to be. There is no, option A or option B. And then as a result of this, this is how things are going to fall into place. So, in other words, from the very start, I'm going back to the Stoic view here. From the very start of any phase of the ordering of the universe, as you are probably aware, right? For the Stoics, the universe goes back and forth between conflagration and ordering. But from the very start of any phase of the ordering of the universe, all the structures of reality are already present in the divine logos. And the manner in which these will unfold in a certain sequence towards a good order is already encoded in the point of origin. Teleology, as the Stoics see it, does not require any decision-making, not planning, but also not decision-making in the sense of considering alternative options. But there is still another important challenge, I think, for the Stoics. How can we reconcile the notion of logos as the structure of the physical universe manifested in its actual order during the cosmesis on the one hand, with the role of that very same logos as a conscious rational agent on the other? Yet, as baffling as this combination of functions may be, this is exactly, I argue, how the Stoics want us to conceive of their notion of logos logoi, which is exactly why I opted for the notion of thought structures. That the Stoics want to keep divine rationality together with its physical and corporeal manifestation, going back to the start of my paper, is evident from the very terminology they use in the examples we examined here. Seminal logos logoi, referring to the biological model, God as a fire that is also noeros, and conversely, a divine nous that is fiery, and of course also the designation of nature for the active divine principle. Plato may well have turned in his grave, but as contemporary interpreters of Stoicism, we should resist watering down the implications of such expressions. To recapitulate, contrary to the centrality of nous and the noetic in Plato and Aristotle, I may add, this semantic field appears to have played a much more minimal role in early Stoicism. But the early Stoics did call their god nous, especially when they wanted to emphasize his providence, pronoia. In other usages, they made sure to emphasize the corporeal nature of the divine nous and the primacy of their notion of logos. Later Stoics, such as Seneca and Epictetus, that is, in a specific phase of Stoicism, they translated the notion of seminal logos logoi into thoughts of God, in the, again, very specific context of the condition of Zeus, or the active divine principle, between a conflagration and the next ordering cycle of the universe. In doing so, they built on the original Stoic connection between nous and pronoia and maintained the convergence of divine logos logoi with its or their physical manifestation. Although for the Stoics, God does share a kind of self-perception with human beings, divine thinking does not require any translation of physical and corporeal reality or interpretation into the propositional content of sayables, as so I have suggested. Unlike human craftsmen, God has no need to plan for his providential action. That is, he does not need to rely on impressions to carry out the purposes of cosmic order, nor does he need to deliberate between alternative options. Perhaps we struggle with grasping how radical the Stoic position on divine thought structures in fact was, because we, whether or not we are aware of it, are Platonists, Aristotelians, or nominalists. We can talk about why I think the Stoics are not nominalists. We can, if you want, that's the third one, but maybe I'll leave that for the discussion. It's a bit complicated. In response to George Boyce Stone's claim that my interpretation would amount to a form of Spinozan rationalism avant la lettre, I would plead guilty as charged. In transforming it for his own purposes, Spinoza indeed picked up on the distinctiveness of a position such as the Stoic one. Thank you.